Commander Redford Kalin had to apply his full measure of restraint to simply not groan or roll his eyes as George Lintar ranted passionately. Glancing to his right, Juliana Winfield was, as always, less tactful. Even Frederick Anderson and William Hempstroke, who usually sided with the old man, showed signs that they were reaching the limits of their patience. The prince was not present, though he did not know why. He wouldn't ask, however. If he needed to know, the prince would tell him in time. If not, then it was not of his concern. That the Drazen destroyer was captured. The surviving Drazen were dealt with and the ship's captain was captured. It's being interrogated as we speak, the old man said with an almost polite expression that turned into one of veiled mockery. It is a shame that the masterful display of your sister, Lady Cynthia, will go unrecognized, Juliana. Our duty was fulfilled, nothing more, Juliana replied as a frown adorned her features. Now, old man, have you grown tired of hearing your own voice, or will you continue torturing our ears with it? Lukacs Ishtal cleared his throat, masking a chuckle, while William and Hannah did not succeed. He only smiled at the more than deserved jab. George may be loyal, but he was set on his ways, and it was no secret that he enjoyed the political games that, in his opinion, plagued the nobility like a corrosive disease. George frowned. As a matter of fact, there is one more point that needs to be discussed, he said, turning to Redford with a glare. Commander Redford, may we know why that traitor has not been executed? The smile left his lips and his stern, serious persona returned. For the same reason he is in a Medicare pod, healing from his injuries, Commander George, he spat venomously. Wyatt Staples is not a traitor. George slammed a fist on the table in response. The device was found in his quarters. It is clear that he's been a traitor all along. To everyone's surprise, William Hempstroke was the first to counter his argument. If you believe in that obvious ploy at misdirection and falsehood, then I pity your division and I put in doubt your position as commander, George. Do not let your petty and contrived thoughts regarding commoners fog your vision. Wyatt Staples may be a lowly commoner, but he has already shown that he is talented, capable, and loyal, the red-haired man smirked. Or do you need to see his performance against 30 Drazen fighters again? Vivian let out a laugh. The Woodshaft Ace, they call him, and they have not seen the footage from the fighter's perspective. If we had another 100 pilots like him, I'm sure they would find a way to take down a battleship on their own. That pilot of yours is crazy, Redford, she ended with praise. George sneered at them both. He's still commoner trash, no matter his deeds. Can't you see that he has gained too much favor with the Prince and Princess Clara? The nerve! The sheer absurdity of that notion is enough to make my stomach turn with disgust. When has a lowly, worthless, flea-ridden commoner been close to royalty before? Frederick nodded. I must concur with your statement, George. Wyatt Staples, as a commoner, has no political, economic, or social strong points. That Princess Clara is showing so much, favoritism is worrying. The prince himself approves of him, even. It is clear that Wyatt Staples is only seeking to extract privileges from their majesties. He must be stopped from enacting whatever vile, underhanded plans he has in mind. That is going far enough, Redford retorted. How dare you question our liege's decision? Wyatt Staples has shown himself as loyal and, unlike you, has no interest at all in any sort of power move. He lacks education and the knowledge to even begin to understand the ties and laws, written and in spirit, that bind nobility together. Why? He rasped. Why are you so insistent in bringing him down when we need men and women like him more than ever? Have you considered the consequences of what would happen if this conflict devolves into a civil war? The fact that Drazen raiders have penetrated this deeply without notice suggests that gaps in our borders have become visible. This conflict must be solved quickly, and Duke Draymore must be stopped. Once we arrive at Matcha, we will be able to consolidate our strength and move forth. I'm certain Duke Draymore is doing the same, Juliana reasoned. He's been 3 steps ahead of us so far, and we're racing to catch up. George and Frederick remained silent, but glared at Redford and Juliana in particular. Lukacs sighed. The prince insisted that I share the information about the QEC with his commanders, and this is what you do, bicker and argue as always, acting like we are not waging a war between conflicting royal houses, he admonished. Let me be perfectly clear regarding this issue. Wyatt Staples is not the traitor we are looking for. However, he has already outshone his betters. As such, measures must be taken against him. Redford stood up, glaring at Lukacs. Do not tell me you're planning to court-martial him regardless. What is his crime? Being competent, display exceptional valor and loyalty? Or is it merely the crime of being a commoner? Juliana leaned forth, her intense blue eyes glaring glaciers at her fellow commanders. Are you truly so cowardly that you quake in fear at the mere idea of a single man surpassing your deeds? Hannah Talaro cleared her throat. As much as I dislike such a notion, Juliana, I have to side with Lukacs. Lady Cynthia is receiving the praise she rightfully deserves for her masterful command of the Nornavio, she said, the name rolling out of her mouth with mild humor. But Lieutenant Wyatt's near-suicidal action has few supporters. Most of them come from the wedge he worked with during the battle, and a few other stragglers across the fighter divisions. Even my troops show some mild respect for his reckless behavior, but the rest see him as a potential threat, she said, glancing at Vivian Taravis, gaining a nod from her. Even among the commoner crew members, he's seen with derision and jealousy. Frederick crossed his arms. Redford has a point. As much as I agree that Wyatt Staples has to be dealt with, there has to be a valid motive. Times are trying, but he is still a member of the Royal Navy, and thus we can't simply toss him away. Not to mention he is a lieutenant. Any ideas? I will not allow this mockery to continue unchallenged, Redford said, still standing proudly. I cast a vote of doubt upon Lukacs Ishtal's proposal. Those in favor? To his dismay, only Juliana joined his hand. Outvoted, he sighed in frustration. Very well. What say you, Lukacs? I cast a vote of exclusion upon Redford Kalon. Those in favor? To Redford's surprise, no one raised a hand aside from Lukacs. Noted. Then we shall proceed as normal. Wyatt Staples shall be detained aboard the Nornavio under charges of suspected lèse-majesté and conspiracy against the life and well-being of Princess Clara and Lady Cynthia, not to mention a suspected case of murder perpetrated against a Bacchus Reed. That dimwit's death was of his own doing, Redford protested. A noble still died under the leadership of a commoner, George said. It is a crime that cannot be overlooked, not to mention a dire breach in the conduct and traditions of the Royal Navy as a whole. I second the motion. So do I, William Hemstroke added. Redford watched in silence as one by one the rest of his fellow commanders agreed on the charges set against his pilot. It wasn't nearly enough evidence to convict him of anything, but it was enough for them to excuse sidelining Wyatt at least for a time. Glaring at them all, he turned to Juliana, the only one who rejected the motion alongside himself. It seems we are outvoted. The prince shall hear about this. He already knows, Lukacs said, his cybernetic eyes flickering light for a moment. He has agreed with the charges presented, but wishes that Wyatt Staples be treated fairly and with due diligence. In that case, there is nothing more for us to discuss, Redford said, turning to leave as Juliana also stood up. Vivian raised an eyebrow. We have yet to decide who shall command the new ship, she pointed out. The prince shall decide that himself, Juliana replied, sharing Redford's visible disgust. You may continue plotting against brave, innocent lives now, cowards, said the blue-haired woman, and the two commanders left the room side by side. They walked for several minutes in silence, ignoring their escorts walking behind them and the crew members they stumbled across their way. But they were not silent, not outwardly at least. It seems the prince's plan was a success, said Juliana through a secured, encrypted channel between the two. Now it is only a matter of time for the traitor to bite the bait. As much as I dislike using Wyatt and putting his life on the line, it has to be done. However, I can't understand the reason behind planting the QEC in his quarters. The traitor had to know that attempt would end in utter failure, Redford replied. Perhaps it was a desperate measure. Lukacs and Vivian's efforts were breathing down their necks. Personally, I believe this to be nothing more than a distraction and a futile attempt to gain some time. Most likely, that wasn't the only QEC at their disposal. But if it was, then that means the traitors are hiding and preparing, she replied, and paused for a moment. Will this truly work, Redford? I don't know, something doesn't feel right. We're missing a piece of the puzzle, and I do not like how it looks, he replied. Perhaps it is related to the reason why the prince didn't attend the meeting? She asked with mild concern. I'm certain the prince will inform us if we need to know, Juliana. Patience is a virtue we all must practice and master, the older man replied. In that case, I should be thankful that there are idiots like George who test such virtues with their incomprehensible pretentiousness, she replied, and they shared a short laugh. The two said nothing more as they neared the prince's quarters. The Royal Marines allowed them entry upon their arrival, and soon they were in the same room alongside the prince, Princess Clara, and Cynthia. The two commanders immediately noticed that the two younger women were visibly distraught, while the prince was pensive. Before any of them could inquire about what had managed to disturb the princess and her bodyguard, the prince spoke up. "Redford, Juliana, do you detest the Drazen?" he asked, his tone serious and straight. "I do, my prince," Juliana was the first to reply. "Marines, ROSF units, and army soldiers are usually the first responders to Drazen incursions. This incident is, sadly, not an uncommon occurrence. I've had the immense displeasure of battling Drazen raiders many times. I have not interacted with one directly outside my cockpit, but I hold no love for those detestable aliens," Redford replied. The prince hummed softly. "I am no stranger to the Drazen and their way of thinking. Dealing with them is not an easy task, less so when the raiders operate outside the collective's boundaries. Outlaws, renegades, criminals, savage murderers," he chuckled darkly, "at least on paper. My prince, forgive me for saying this, but what does it matter? Drazen raiding assaults are an annoyance and a true tragedy to those who suffer them. There is no doubt about that. Regardless of anything, Duke Draymor's coup and betrayal outweigh the threat of those unholy creatures," said the older blue-haired woman in a submissive tone. The prince stared into her eyes for several seconds, then turned to his sister. She slowly blinked in response, and then he turned to Cynthia. "Show them." Cynthia bowed her head, and the screen display next to her came to life a second after her armor connected to it. The black screen was replaced by the picture of Wyatt Staples inside his Medicare pod. Then the video began to play, and the two commanders were introduced to Wyatt's tale about his experience with the Drazen. By the time it was over, they saw his raging outburst and the subsequent sedation. "By all that is good and holy," Juliana said, mirroring her sister's downward expression, "it is a miracle that he's functioning at all." Redford nodded, crossing his arms. "That amount of mental trauma should have broken his mind. He has remarkable strength." "I believe it is not so simple," Clara said, glancing at the now still image of a sleeping Wyatt. "We saw his mask break. He secluded himself within himself since he was but a mere child. I think he truly doesn't have any friends, at all. We don't know how his time at the academy truly was, but what little we know so far shows it wasn't a pleasant time either. He has a noble soul, and I believe he is an honorable man in his peculiar way," Cynthia added. "And yet when he took command of the Noir Navio, he showed remarkable competence and measured bloodlust, focused, aimed, precise. Given such traits and his innate talent and capabilities, there is no telling what he could achieve. He is not only talented, he has immense potential that could be exploited in the right circumstances," Redford reasoned. "He killed Samuel Caiston without hesitation, ignoring all sense of decorum and the rules of combat. I doubt he even knows what they are. He took command of the Noir Navio, even if your logic was flawless, Cynthia. If any of the others discover the truth, they will demand Wyatt's head for overreaching or breaking the line that separates nobility and commoners." Juliana groaned. "Nobles lead, commoners follow. Nobility rules, civilians obey. Sadly, the words of the great Julius Astor have been warped and forgotten over the centuries." "George would have a heart attack if he heard you," the prince joked. "As it stands, Wyatt Staples has become an unwilling player in our current problem. Now that I know about his past, I am conflicted about using him as a pawn in this plan of ours." "It would break whatever bond we've formed so far with him," Cynthia reasoned, and watched as her princess's left hand twitched slightly. They had met the pilot not too long ago, but already he had proven himself as more than a mere anomaly. Everything she'd told him rang true. She now trusted him, for she'd seen that he was loyal without the vice of power clouding his vision. More importantly, her princess and best friend Clara had come to appreciate him even more. At first, it was curiosity and a selfish indulgence to satiate her hobby, but then she grew interested in him personally, and now she saw in Wyatt not a pawn or a useful tool, but a friend, a treasure that Clara valued immensely. So to imagine that Wyatt would turn away from them if he discovered he had been betrayed and used by the people he had perhaps started to trust left a bad taste in her mouth. She was sure he'd leave them at the first chance he got. She was equally certain that even with the betrayal, he wouldn't go running to Duke Draymore's side. Instead, he'd commit desertion, and they would lose a man with incredible potential forever. Then, why don't we do something he'd do? Clara asked all of a sudden, and all eyes turned to her. Something crazy and unorthodox, outside the box. Why not? She paused for a moment and then snapped her fingers. Why don't we treat this as if it was a dogfight? The following silence was palpable, and the princess blushed in slight embarrassment. The prince stood up and walked over to his desk where a chessboard rested with its pieces untouched. He stared at it for several moments in silent contemplation before turning to his sister. Explain. An eager smile spread across her face. We are a wedge, she began, and the traitor is the enemy wedge. Our mission is not to destroy them, but to force them to make a mistake without any of us taking damage. We need to weave and turn in ways that they don't expect us to act. We must make use of our greater mobility to outmatch them completely. Currently, they are hidden among an asteroid field, but we know they are there. How do we draw them out? With a convincing decoy. Redford nodded. Wyatt is the decoy in this situation, but I fail to understand your strategy, Clara. It is quite simple, Redford. We cheat, Clara said, as if stating the obvious. A decoy is usually a drone or something similar, correct? Redford nodded. What is our enemy expecting from us? To lure them out so we may attack. But they will hardly do anything about it if they expect this to be a trap. We are a wedge, she repeated. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It is a fair fight. Let's make it unfair. Let's go to battle with our wedge by having a hidden sixth member. Juliana barked out a laugh while Redford's mouth opened slightly. Cynthia was stunned but smiling, and the prince turned to his chessboard before gently flicking a pawn over. My dear sister, are you proposing we inform Wyatt about our plan, that we turn the decoy into a pilot? Would that not put at risk our chances of capturing the traitor red-handed? If I may, Cynthia interjected, and the prince gave her a nod. I've seen Wyatt in action personally, my prince. I believe he can not only be trusted with this information, but actively help us. He knows well how to hide his emotions and conceal his intentions. It would require something extreme as what made him revive his past and everything that happened before for him to break again. That is a risky but brilliant idea, Redford commented. Our enemy is expecting us to make a move regarding Wyatt's position. Would they expect the prince to rely on a mere commoner instead of simply using him as a tool? I believe not. Risky. But this is a development our little traitor won't expect, Juliana said with a wide, viscous smile. I like it. My prince, she said, turning to face the blond man. If this succeeds, may I attempt to lure Wyatt Staples into pledging allegiance to House Winfield? Denied, the prince replied with a smirk. Juliana merely shrugged, also smirking. Redford, go to Wyatt and inform him of our plan. We shall need his aid. It shall be done, my liege, Redford said, saluting and bowing courtly before the young blond man. I wish to accompany you, Redford, Clara said, joining his side. After opening up to us and what you are going to tell him, seeing a pair of friendly faces might be beneficial for his emotional stability. Redford raised an eyebrow curiously. A sound tactical move, princess? Shush, you! When Wyatt woke up from a dreamless sleep, he was in a far better condition, but with the constant silent vigilance of a Royal Marine as his only company, he was bereft of any means to pass the time. Left alone with his thoughts, his mind wandered. The pain was completely gone, which was a welcomed change. The AI also informed him that the damage to his Dulaxis implant had been contained and, much to his relief, replaced during his slumber, and did not require him to endure the pain of adapting to it once more. He would be cleared to leave in a few hours, which was a good thing. He had grown tired of being stuck for at least 3 whole days. even if most of that time he spent sleeping. However, what occupied his mind the most was what he told the two women, and his subsequent breakdown. He hadn't been in his right mind, and he had allowed emotions to explode in full before other people. What do they think of me now, I wonder? Do they think I'm dangerous? Do they think I'm just alive because I got lucky? Do they despise me for threatening the life of a noble? Wyatt thought grimly. He hardly knew them, but in just a couple of weeks he'd gone through numerous situations with them that allowed him to get to know them better than anyone else for as long as he could remember. Cynthia was steadfast, loyal, a stickler for rules and protocol, and outwardly cold. When he met her, he saw her as a wall of ice and titanium that would not bend. But now he knew there was a warmer, caring person behind that wall. Her loyalty toward Clara was absolute and unquestionable, and she was not afraid to speak her mind when it was necessary. That was without taking into account her deadly abilities in combat. On the other hand, Clara was far more approachable and gentle. She was curiously shy in some aspects, but forward in others, easily excitable and brimming with curiosity and genuine kindness. A rarity among nobles, let alone royalty. But beneath that, she was shown to be capable of ruthlessness and a savvy mind that honestly scared him. It was as if her personality switched if her negotiation with Uriel Hoax was a common occurrence. But instead of making demands, which she had full authority to do, she preferred to take a mutually beneficial approach. That alone, and her refusal to leave Woodshaft for the sake of the people living there, had cemented his respect for her. So what do they think of me now? Perhaps I should consider desertion, after all. He thought to himself a minute before the doors to the medical bay opened, and through those gates walked three figures. Clara, Cynthia, and— "Commander Redford?" he said out loud, glad that his throat no longer rasped nor ached. "I see that you are in much better health, Lieutenant," Redford said as they approached his pod. "How are you feeling, Woodshaft's ace?" "I'm feeling— Wait, Woodshaft's ace?" he asked, taken aback. He turned to the two women present and saw that Cynthia gave him a "what did you expect?" look while Clara giggled softly. "Your reckless stunt against the Drazen fighters has been taken to heart among the people of Woodshaft. They know your name, Wyatt. The actions of the Noir Navio truly outshine your deeds, but as an opening move to the battle against the Drazen, it was quite a spectacle. You've earned the title of ace more than twice over, Wyatt Staples. Congratulations are in order," Redford said, but his face did not convey his words. "Ace, I'm an ace?" he asked out loud, only to then realize that he, indeed, had earned the right to bear such a title. He blushed slightly, suddenly remembering his near-nudeness. Inspecting Redford's expression further, his bashfulness gave way to worry. "I see, Commander. Then, does that mean I shall be executed?" It was a good thing that he knew more about Wyatt after Cynthia's revelation and the recording of his past and breakdown, otherwise he'd be shocked at the frightening leap of logic on display. Glancing to his left, he saw that both Clara and Cynthia were also not surprised. Nevertheless, he had to ask, "Why do you believe achieving such a thing would warrant your death, Wyatt Staples?" Wyatt chuckled softly. After pouring his heart out, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders, and he felt more at ease with himself. It didn't make things easier, but the burden was not as cumbersome anymore. Outshining the accomplishments only reserved for nobles deserves punishment. I was already treading on rotten timber when I won the competition. Now I've surely gained the ire of many nobles, have I not? He asked, hiding his bitterness. I don't mind dying. At least now I know that they don't look at me differently, and I helped save thousands of lives while burning thousands more Drazan. Let that be enough. A commoner cannot ask for a more dignified end. There is some backlash, yes, but the enemy in this case is hated by all. I'm afraid that while your situation and the circumstances are bothersome to deal with, there is another pressing matter that, sadly, involves you personally, Redford clarified. It has been decided that you will be detained and put under court-martial to review your offenses and possible collusion with traitors, he said, and raised a hand when Wyatt's mouth went agape. Let me finish. Wyatt barely contained the burst of rage burning in his chest after hearing that accusation. Me, a traitor? Not even in my worst days has that idiotic idea crossed my mind. Desertion is one thing, but treason— He raged internally for a few seconds, then looked at the two women who, in turn, gave him reassuring looks that choked the fire out. "The QEC was found in your quarters, Lieutenant. Do not fret, for we do not question your loyalty. The traitor sought to get rid of a potential enemy at the same time as sowing disunion and chaos between our ranks. This, however, presents us with a unique opportunity to find the head of the Viper and cut it down. And you, Wyatt Staples, may be able to aid your prince further," Redford explained calmly. Wyatt's eyes widened for a moment, and he nodded. "No, I forbid it," Clara interjected all of a sudden, her expression firm and serious. "You will not just obey, Wyatt. This puts your life at risk, and I'm afraid you won't be able to mat a fighter, or command the Noir Navio to fight this enemy." Wyatt paled at her confession. He knew that Cynthia was bound to tell Clara about him taking command of the Noir Navio. That was also a given regarding the prince. But now that Redford knew, he was sure. Why doesn't he look surprised or outraged that a mere commoner dared to sully such a vessel with its hands? As if reading his mind, the older man spoke. "I already know. So does Commander Juliana, and of course my prince. It was thanks to your actions and Cynthia's quick thinking of a loophole that ensured our crushing victory over the Drazen raiders. Know that His Majesty the Prince is immensely proud and grateful for saving not only countless lives and ships, but also for saving the life of his beloved sister for a second time, Lieutenant." "As I am," Redford said, and then did the unthinkable. He bowed his head respectfully for a short moment. "Warning, patient's heart rate is increasing to dangerous levels," the AI chimed in. While Redford blinked in confusion and Wyatt was trying to not hyperventilate, Clara approached the pod until she placed a hand on the crystal. "He is not a noble showing respect to you, Wyatt. He is a man thanking you, nothing more." "Just a man," he repeated, slowly getting his breathing under control. "I know that. He's just a man, but he's still a noble, my direct superior. For him to thank a lowly commoner with such a gesture and not mere empty words, it is unthinkable, and yet I have received it. I don't know how to feel about this," he thought, but he still managed to keep himself from passing out or being sedated again. He glanced at the princess and her bodyguard and felt a wave of tranquility wash over him, just enough to let him get a grip on his emotions once more. A nod signaled that he was under control. "As I was saying," Clara continued, "this is a battlefield in which we are more familiar than you are. We ask you to place your life in our hands, but I will not allow you to blindly obey such a command. I want you to decide for yourself, not as a commoner, but as Wyatt Staples. Understood?" Wyatt nodded slowly. Then he watched Clara step back until she stood next to Cynthia. Redford stepped up and sighed deeply. "Lieutenant Wyatt Staples, you will be detained and placed under arrest. Tomorrow, you shall be court-martialed. Be not afraid. The prince will not allow harm to come to you. We require that you act as you normally would upon the charges you will be accused of, with a minor distinction." He raised a finger. "We need you to be insulting and abrasive, just enough to make the traitor in our midst believe that you could be swayed to their side as retaliation." Wyatt stopped himself, only briefly glancing at Clara. "What do I do now? I can't refuse a request made by the prince himself, but at the same time, I can't refuse Clara's request. Come to think of it, why are they telling me in the first place? I'm a commoner. Even if the traitor approaches me, what am I to do? There's no need to tell me any of this unless they think I'm valuable. But what can the life of a single commoner achieve in this situation? Ugh, think, Wyatt. How would you handle this if this were a dogfight with nothing to—" His train of thought came to a crashing halt as a small but wicked smile spread across his lips. "Am I to act as a living decoy to lure our enemies out so that you can strike them from when they least expect it?" Clara smiled, proud of herself, while Cynthia shook her head slowly. Redford limited himself to give a single approving nod. Wyatt closed his eyes for a moment, his mind already weighing the pros and cons of such a plan, and concluded that a traitor, a noble, would not expect that the prince would ever rely on a commoner to execute his plan. But that won't be enough to lure the mastermind out. What could ensure the trap to spring? He asked himself as dozens of options and scenarios ran across his mind until a risky idea manifested itself. "Commander Redford, he said after a minute of silence. "I will aid the prince at the fullest of my abilities." His grin intensified. "Loyalty is its own reward." "Loyalty is its own reward," Redford replied, the hint of a proud smile appearing on his lips. Then he closed his eyes. "The prince shall be happy to learn of your willing cooperation, Lieutenant." "Wyatt," Cynthia said firmly, "what are you planning to do?" She asked firmly, ready to stop him from pulling another stunt like he did before during the fight against the Drazen. He turned to the blue-haired woman. "Since I'll be acting as a decoy, how about instead I become a tactical mine?" True to Commander Redford's words, not 10 minutes after he was out of the Medicare pod, he had been arrested and escorted to his cell in the Exalted Virtues brig. His captors, a group of regular Marines and security personnel, made it a show by forcing him to walk through the longest and most crowded way leading to his cell. Every set of eyes he saw staring at him showed either morbid curiosity or confusion in the case of the very few who knew who he was. He only stumbled across Nultar Okara, one of the members of Epsilon Squadron and a fallen noble. The look of disbelief and then confusion at least reassured him that his temporary teammate disapproved of what he was seeing. He had stood up for him once previously against Salazar Reed's stupid accusations. That made him smile slightly. Other than that, his capture had gone without further drama. That had happened a few hours ago, given his best guess. He had no way to tell the time. There were no guards around, and he had an entire wing all for himself. His only company was the 2 cameras dangling from the ceiling outside his cell, watching his every movement. Sweat trailed down his brow as he counted his 30th sit-up. Everything that had happened in a short amount of time had denied him the time to work out, and he did not want to lose his physical condition. "Not that I have anything better to do," he thought to himself. His Ontoro implant was useless inside his cell, effectively keeping him isolated. Truth be told, despite agreeing to help the prince in capturing the traitor in their midst, he was feeling nervous. Being unable to use his strengths in battle left him utterly powerless. Not that it mattered, since the battlefield he was walking into was foreign to him. He was used to making quick quips and submitting quickly before his betters. This was an entirely different beast altogether. Luckily for him, he was not going to be alone in said battle. He stood up with a huff, glad that his other 2 implants were working properly. He had already finished 3 entire sets, of which one would have left him ragged before getting the Dulaxis and Kinetor implants. But now, he was only winded, leaving him with a burning satisfaction across his muscles. He walked to the water dispenser and paused when he noticed something odd. Taking a few steps back and then moving forward confirmed it. The cameras were no longer following him. Frowning, he moved to the back of his cell slowly, his eyes fixed on the metal bars. It took several seconds until he heard several pairs of feet approaching his way. His hands turned to fists, ready for anything. Moments prior, a Royal Marine came into view carrying a small, regular basket. Wyatt instantly relaxed when a second Royal Marine carrying 2 small, rectangle-shaped boxes appeared, and finally, a third appeared before opening his cell. The second Royal Marine stepped in first, casually unfolding a small table and a chair. Then he stepped out, and a new set of feet clanged against the floor, only for 3 additional Royal Marines to appear in formation. The air between them flickered, and a stealth field died, revealing the prince himself. "My prince!" Wyatt almost choked at the sight of the prince before dropping to a respectful knee. The second he'd seen a Royal Marine all fight left his body. He knew perfectly well that if he was there to kill him, there would be nothing he could do about it. He wasn't sure if having the prince before him was a better or worse outcome. "Stand," the prince said firmly but gently. Wyatt obeyed, and only then he noticed the prince was carrying a checkered box of sorts. He watched in silence as the prince, with a placid smile on his face, opened the box and slowly retrieved pieces from within it, setting them aside in 2 groups, white pieces and black pieces. "Is that a chessboard?" the pilot asked himself. "Do you know this game, Wyatt?" the prince asked as he casually began to place the pieces on the board. Unwilling to approach his majesty, he replied with as courtly as he could manage. "I do, my liege. May I clothe myself? I do not wish to be an eyesore, my prince." "You may," the prince answered. "I'm pleased that you know of chess. Do you know how to play?" Wyatt moved to his discarded shirt and uniform vest, putting them on hastily. "I do, my prince, although I'm afraid I'm not a good player." The prince raised an eyebrow, setting the final piece on the board. Then he turned to Wyatt. "Is that so?" Wyatt gulped. "Back at the academy, every cadet is required to play and know several games that will help discover and develop our aptitudes. Chess among them. I only played a few dozen times. I've never once won a match," he confessed. To his bewilderment, the prince smiled. "Then, mayhaps, I shall taste victory for the first time in a long time," he said with humor before making a gesture with his hand, inviting him to sit on his metal bed and across the table to face him. "I love playing chess. However, I am no prodigy nor a particularly good player either." "You have got to be kidding," Wyatt blurted out before he could stop himself. He clasped a hand over his mouth and he paled slightly when the prince chuckled heartily. In his defense, he had pretty much insulted the prince, called him a liar, and addressed him without proper conduct, all at the same time. But his declaration had been so outlandish that his lips moved on their own. "I'm afraid I do not, Lieutenant Wyatt Staples. Come, join me," the prince replied without resentment in his voice. "Despite my many advantages, especially over someone of your standing, chess is not a forte of mine. It is a cruel irony to love something so much but lack the aptitude to be proficient in it." Wyatt removed his hand and sheepishly sat across the prince, his heart racing quickly in his chest. Before him rested the chessboard with the black set presented to him. "I much prefer the white ones, but I am not about to tell the prince that, now am I?" he said to himself nervously. "My stay won't be long. Do not worry. None shall know of my visit except for those closest to me," he said before reaching for a pawn and moving it forward, opening the game. Wyatt nodded, not knowing how to reply to his words. He looked at the board and made his move. "My prince, if I may ask?" "I'm here because I wish to congratulate you on your victory personally, Wyatt Staples," the prince answered, knowing what the pilot wanted to ask him. He moved another pawn. "Your actions during your encounter against the Drazen fighters were reckless. Your decision to go out and plant a mine with the goal of destroying what? 3, maybe 4 boarding pods at most was stupid but brave. What were you planning to do after had you not encountered the Drazen response?" Wyatt felt his heart slowly calm down, even under the watchful eyes of the Royal Marines. "I would have destroyed any boarding pod and shuttle I came across until my ammo was depleted. Then I would have returned to the Noir Navio," he replied, moving another piece. "I wasn't thinking clearly. My mind was fogged with hatred and it nearly cost me my life. And yet you responded to their fighters in a manner that not many would even consider," the prince replied. "Reckless, emotional, exceptional. You were rather fortunate to have survived that," another piece moved. "Without my implants, I doubt I would have survived the maneuvers I applied. That reminds me, I must thank Commander Redford for ensuring I received those implants when I see him next," he thought, as he moved another piece. "Try not to get yourself killed, please." The prince let out a single chuckle. "I'm a very avaricious man. I would not like to lose you so easily, Wyatt Staples," he said, moving another piece. "As an Aster, my resources are nearly limitless within the principality. But as the prince, that is multiplied exponentially. Wealth, power, political influence, and so much more. Yet my avarice is directed at the most precious, rarest treasures of all: talent, competence, and loyalty, which in turn makes you valuable in my eyes, Lieutenant." Wyatt gulped nervously after receiving such direct praise from the prince. It wasn't the first time he'd done it, but that didn't make it easier to handle. Checking the board for a few seconds, he moved another piece. "I am honored to receive your praise, my prince. A lowly commoner such as I do not deserve it. You've saved countless lives after taking command of the Noir Navio. You saved the life of my beloved sister for a second time, nearly losing yours in the process. And now you are yet again putting your life on the line in a matter that concerns you very little," the prince replied, then moved another piece. "Words cannot express my gratitude, Wyatt Staples. If not for my uncle's coup attempt, I would reward you accordingly," he chuckled. "Then again, I would not know you otherwise. You'd still be a compost hauler, your immense potential and talent wasted with me being none the wiser. I do not deserve your gratitude, my prince. Lives were saved and Drazen were burned. Loyalty is its own reward. Wyatt replied sincerely before making his move. Truly, the prince said. Wyatt, do you plan on taking Sirhan Gimor's life? He asked, then moved his piece. Plan is a strong word, my prince, the pilot answered without hesitation. But yes, if he ever comes across my path, I will drag him to the Drazan and watch as they kill and turn them into their precious feed. If I can't make him suffer the same fate my friends, teachers, and thousands more went through, then I'll kill him, and all of them shall be avenged either way. He moved another piece. The prince hummed deeply. I can hardly say that your anger is unjustified. He moved a piece. Are you a calm and reasonable man, Wyatt Staples, or is the true Wyatt a bloodthirsty, death-seeking fool? So that's what he wants to know, Wyatt thought seriously before making his move. Sirhan Gimor sold the lives of over 6,000 commoners, most of them children, and nobles coming from lesser houses to save his own. Their lives were his responsibility. He paused for the prince to make his move. The implant he spoke about, does it even exist, my prince? If it does, I'm not aware of it, the prince replied. Wyatt moved and shook his head. It doesn't matter. It was a stupid question. But you needed to know, the prince moved. Regardless of anything, and as much as I hate myself for what I'm about to say, I would have done the same thing he did, but with different goals, the pilot said, voice rasping with barely contained anger. His cowardice is the sole reason anyone survived the Drazan assault and likely saved tens of thousands more, he added, and moved. I would have tricked the Drazan with the sole intent of beating them and saving as many innocent lives as I could manage. The prince nodded slowly. As you stand today, I do not doubt that you would do that. In his case, all I can say is that such is the burden of nobility. He escaped, throwing away his dignity and honor, and yet he performed his duty. Am I correct to assume he contacted the nearest Royal Navy forces after his escape? He asked and doubted only for a moment before making his move. Wyatt nodded. He did. A Navy patrol arrived just in time to save the survivors. He narrowed his eyes. It was only later that I learned that the reason the Drazan didn't kill me like they did Wantum and my friends and classmates was because I passed their strange cattle selecting process. He spat with dry poison. Then he made his move. Lucky me. The prince noted his sarcasm but did not comment on it. He moved his piece. That I've come to understand and comprehend. It was a gamble on his part and it worked. Had he stood and fought, he would have died and every life saved would have been lost, Wyatt continued. The reason I hate Sirhan Gimor is because he had no shame in how he used and painted the whale situation to his advantage. He didn't make a cowardly deal with the monstrous Drazan. He used his guile and savvy intellect to trick them. He chuckled darkly. He didn't flee, leaving thousands to die. He made a tactical retreat to call for reinforcements. He used their deaths and the tragedy in his favor to make himself the hero of the hour, and he was rewarded and thanked for it by grieving families that swallowed his lies like morning dew. He honored their sacrifice with a few seconds of silence before basking in the glory of his great achievement. Some say that triumph washes away all shame. I agree with that philosophy. He took a deep breath and then made his move. Check. The prince blocked Wyatt's piece. For the next couple of minutes, the blonde and the black-haired man continued to play in silence until the prince found his voice first. Do you seek revenge? The satisfaction of doing what you believe will bring you peace, Wyatt. The pilot shook his head and took another of the prince's pawns. Revenge was tempting once, but what would it give me? A painful death? A quick end if I'm lucky? He scoffed. I want justice, but I won't seek it. Sirhan Gimor's actions condemned many lives but ended up saving countless others. My father once told me that the greatest revenge a man can deal to a hated enemy is to live a long, prosperous, happy life. Sage advice, the prince agreed. And yet, if Sirhan Gimor crosses paths with you, he shall meet either a gruesome end or a quick death? The prince asked, making his move. He will, Wyatt sighed deeply. I shall leave that to fate itself, he moved. However, if you order me to, my prince, I shall give up on the promise I made to end Sirhan Gimor's pathetic, lying life. The prince was pensive for several moments. "As a reward for playing a crucial role in saving my sister's life a second time, Lieutenant Wyatt, I shall overlook your threat against a noble and allow fate to decide what will become of him." Then made his move. "I pray that such an encounter never occurs. You have become too valuable to me, and more so, to my sister and Cynthia." Wyatt bowed his head deeply in gratitude. "If I am to be of service, let it be so, my prince," he muttered softly, then made his move. "Quite so," the prince replied and smiled. With a final move, he announced, "Checkmate?" A pleased sigh escaped his lips. "Thank you for not losing on purpose, Wyatt." "I would never dare to insult you in such a manner, my prince," Wyatt replied, and his stomach chose that precise moment to rumble. Excuse me, my liege. It seems this is the perfect moment to give you my sister's gift, a small token of her appreciation and payment for gallantry," the prince said with mild humor present in his voice. The Royal Marine, who had been standing perfectly still holding the basket, approached and placed it next to Wyatt. He removed the silk-like cloth covering the contents of the basket only to reveal a dozen or so pieces of sweets. Wyatt's mouth instantly watered, remembering the succulent sweetness of the treats the princess had so generously shared with him during their first private conversation. The prince raised an eyebrow for a moment at the sight of the treats, but did nothing else. "I'm afraid I must go, Wyatt. But before I depart, heed my warning. During the trial, you will be faced with many accusations. This you know. Do not allow your rage to manifest itself recklessly if they use the Drazen assault against you." The pilot felt a surge of fury burn within him at the idea that he'd so much lift a finger to help the Drazen in any way. But that fury was dwarfed by the respect and admiration he suddenly felt toward the blond man who was his liege. Everything about him, from his handsome features to his height and commanding aura, fit him perfectly, but his character shone through, elevating him as someone deserving of the authority and power he commanded. Now more than ever, he was willing to do anything in order to aid the prince in exposing the traitor once and for all. He saluted the prince respectfully as he packed away his precious chessboard. A Royal Marine folded and picked up the table and chair. The stealth field hid the prince, and without anything left to say, they left, leaving the lieutenant alone once more. Wyatt hummed, and his stomach rumbled. Grabbing a small cake, he licked his lips, ready to eat the sweet confection. He took a bite and smiled. "I'm ready," he muttered to himself as he proceeded to devour his sweets quickly. The cameras only came back to life after he hid the basket under his metallic bed. Wyatt glanced around the ample room as he sat on a desk by his lonesome right in front of the podium, where Lukacs Ishtal stood firmly. There were several officers in the room, sitting on the rows behind him, murmuring quietly between themselves. Most of them he didn't recognize, but there were a few familiar faces among the crowd. Galt Tirome, for one, had his hands cuffed with a Royal Marine standing next to him. Salazar Reed was also present. The Marine was not bothering to hide the satisfaction he felt upon seeing the lowly commoner getting what he deserved. He also recognized the members of Epsilon Squadron further on the back, but their expressions were impassive and contemplative. Most in the audience were nobles, of course, with only a few warrant officers present to give testimonies when needed. "I'm sure there are more commoners waiting outside. No need to sully the eyes of so many blue bloods with the presence of lowly commoners," Wyatt reasoned, making sure to send an annoyed glare at Lukacs Ishtal. At his sides sat the other commanders present in the fleet alongside Admiral Damian Valto, filling the last gap that required 9 high-ranking officers to conduct the court-martial process. Behind and above the 9 officers that were his judges, a balcony of sorts could be seen. There, the prince and his sister, Princess Clara, sat next to each other in silence while Cynthia stood, as always, next to her friend in charge. Lukacs raised a hand and the room went silent. "Per naval laws and traditions, I hereby pronounce the start of this trial against the commoner Wyatt Staples. Branch, Royal Navy, current rank, lieutenant, specialization, pilot. Given that the records of his service prior to his arrival on List 17, 4156 Standard Astorian Principality Calendar, and June 8, 26702 Standard Terran Calendar are lost within the depths of the mutinous Third Fleet's records. We demand that you confirm this information." "I confirm it," Wyatt replied. Do you, Wyatt Staples, swear upon the laws of the Principality and the name of the Prince himself currently present to witness this trial, to speak only the truth? Lukacs asked. I swear to speak nothing but the truth, he said, and managed not to bow his head toward the prince. That action got the crowd to murmur for a few seconds until George Lintar smacked a gavel twice, demanding silence in the room. Let it be recorded that the accused has given his oath. May justice be dealt swiftly. Let us commence. Lukacs cleared his throat. Wyatt Staples, before your arrival, your role in the Third Fleet was that of a compost hauler in the lingering systems. Is this correct? It is. Is it true that you just happened to be located in the same system that the Royal Favor arrived at from the pursuit of an until then unknown enemy vessel? Furthermore, you have been credited for saving not only the Royal Favor but the lives of its occupants and that of Princess Clara herself? Lukacs pressed on. It is true, Wyatt replied dryly. The Third Fleet sided with Duke Cornelius Draymore of Camrim in his coup attempt. What made you decide to ignore the commands of your superiors and rescue the Royal Favor? Was it selfishness, the chance to obtain a substantial reward, or the need to ingratiate yourself to royalty? Asked George, his tone marred with disdain and contempt directed at the pilot. I was not aware that the coup even existed until Commander Redford told me about it, Wyatt began. I was coming back from a regular haul when the royal yacht appeared. I had no orders besides what I was given for that week of work. Nothing more. He set his gaze on George before continuing. What other reason could I, a commoner, have to assist in the rescue of a member of the royal family other than that I am part of the Royal Navy? Would you not do your duty simply because it is expected of you to do so? We ask the questions here, commoner, George spat back. Let him speak, George. It is his right to defend himself, and your questions were hardly easy to answer without wrapping a noose around his own neck, Frederick Anderson said next to the old man. Then he focused on the pilot. That being said, do you truly expect us to believe that you never planned on gaining something from your actions, even when it put you at risk? I expect for you to not believe me at all, Wyatt replied in a cold, emotionless tone that gained several murmurs and a few gasps behind him. I simply did as duty demanded without seeking a reward. And yet our liege rewarded you, a mere commoner with a rank that none of your ilk is fit to hold, replied Hannah Talaro. But that is beside the point. Altruism and duty aside, according to Commander Redford Calonne's report, you saved the Royal Favor by, and I quote, tossing a garbage container at the enemy ship only to shoot at it, making it explode on their faces? Wyatt shrugged. I had a standard PD cannon in the compost container at my disposal. I had to get creative with it. It worked, didn't it? You may question his motives, but not the results, Redford said. This charge was bogus at best. Satisfied, George? The old man huffed. Very well. We merely needed clarification of that incident. The next charge is much more grave, he began. Wyatt Staples, you stand accused of lèse-majesté. We have proof that you, dirty commoner, tried to shake hands with Her Majesty, Princess Clara. Not only that, you have not paid proper respect toward their majesties on numerous occasions. One such is evident upon the start of this trial. Wyatt narrowed his eyes. I am being put on trial for something I didn't do. I don't even know what lèse-majesté is. A blatant lie, of course, but one that served his purpose. Was I supposed to do anything? So not only are you an insolent fool, but also an ignorant one as well? Lukacs remarked, shaking his head. Ignorance is no excuse for a crime committed, Lieutenant. Which also carries cleanly to another charge, William Hempstroke said, leaving aside the tragic murder of Abacus Reed. Numerous crew members have reported hearing you badmouth nobility and, by extension, the royal family. Such one incident happened in the mess hall, where you nearly came to blows with 3 nobles, and you even barked at them like an animal. Is this correct? It isn't, Wyatt replied dryly and smiled internally. He could see that his lack of submissiveness and his tone that skirted on being disrespectful was starting to irk some of the commanders present. Admiral Damien remained mostly impassive, yet amused if his lifted eyebrow was any indication. I was approached by— We don't want to hear your excuses, commoner, George interjected. Then again, what can be expected from a man such as yourself? Since the altercation was a minor one, you shall receive a penalization on your record for that incident. The accounts of lèse-majesté, however, are worrying. Bring in the first witness. Wyatt gave the old commander a glare as a parade of witnesses came through for the next 10 minutes. Most of them were commoner crew members, mechanics, assistants, wards, low-class engineers, general staff, cleaning crew, and security personnel. One by one, they gave a short recount of having heard him say something negative about the nobles, bad-mouthing their leadership, and, worst of all, implying that now that he gained the attention of the prince, he could claim a great bounty for himself. Internally, he was laughing. The poor men and women called on stage were not very convincing. Some of the nobles were far too dramatic for their own good, but there was one that he genuinely thought put a convincing performance. With a shaky voice, he claimed that he had heard him curse at Princess Clara, and heavily implying, but not outright saying it, that she was a fool he could manipulate. "You better watch your back, or whoever told you to say that should," Wyatt thought as the noble witness, thankfully the last, was escorted out of the room. He glanced at the balcony for no more than a second and saw that the three spectators were not amused by the display. Cynthia looks about ready to slap someone into unconsciousness for insulting Clara. "Does anyone require any more proof that this man should not hold his position and should be removed from service?" George pressed on. "Lackluster, misleading, unsubstantial," Juliana listed. "Those claims are as brittle as a poorly made ceramic pot and about as reliable as a farmer holding an assault rifle without guidance. I've heard many complaints and insinuations, but nothing that could be truly labeled as lazy majesté. Were any of them verified as truthful?" The implication was palpable, but Vivian interjected. "They shall be reviewed and put under investigation. However, as William pointed out, the death of Abacus Reed is far more pertinent." "Redford?" The older man nodded. "According to the footage from various fighters and the registered comms record, Abacus Reed acted on his own accord and caused his death and that of two other unfortunate pilots. Let it be recorded that his hot-headedness and glory-seeking tendencies were the reason I denied him the command of Epsilon's squadron. His death was of his own doing." "I demand a duel!" Salazar Reed abruptly interrupted. "That commoner must die for causing the death of my brother." Sensing his chance to be petty without repercussion, Wyatt took it. "Your brother was a foolish pilot who allowed ambition to cloud his mind. I ordered him to desist, and my orders were ignored." Wyatt paused and turned to Salazar for a brief second. "Or is accountability a foreign word to you?" "You miserable scumbag!" Salazar countered and launched himself at Wyatt, only to be stopped by 3 Marines. "Let go of me! I'm Salazar Reed. The honor of my house will not be stained by the words of a filthy commoner." "Silence!" Lukacs demanded, making use of his gavel. "Wyatt, Staples, do not test our patience nor our understanding." Wyatt turned to Lukacs, eyes narrowing. "Am I not allowed to defend myself now? What possible reason could I have to murder Abacus Reed? I did not know him before that day, and I did what I could to save his life. Why am I guilty of his own stupid actions?" "Figures. A commoner would not know decorum, even if it bit him," William sighed. "But I see your logic. There was no probable cause for you to deliberately cause Abacus Reed's demise. The evidence is substantial that his death is not on your hands, Lieutenant." "I shall not stand for this," Salazar barked out once more. "The stain on the honor of my house must be cleansed. I challenge you, commoner filth, to a formal duel." "You have no authority to make such a demand," Frederick countered. "Juliana, as his commander, you have full authority to deal with him. What say you?" "Take him away. I shall deal with him later, and consider your demand rejected," Juliana answered, looking down at the almost fuming Salazar as if he were a particularly ugly bug. "I doubt Lieutenant Wyatt knows what a formal duel is." "I do, in fact, know what it entails," Wyatt answered. "Lady Cynthia was challenged by Samuel Cayston to one. It ended quickly with his death." It was true, even if he didn't go into specifics. "I assume that means a formal duel is a duel to the death?" he asked as Salazar Reed was dragged out of the room, only avoiding making a bigger scene under the fiery gaze of the blue-haired commander. Shortly after, Galt Tyrone was called on stage as a witness to what had happened on the bridge of the Noir Navio, but all he said was a mirror to Wyatt's words. The duel was issued, there was a brief exchange, and then Samuel Cayston died. All that he added was a flowery description of Samuel's courage and the quick, painless death he received at the hands of Cynthia. Seemingly satisfied with his testimony, he was escorted to his seat while the commanders silently talked among each other. After a minute of deliberation, a voice was heard once more. A fine tradition, and one that exalts the honor between houses and a way to settle disputes, George said approvingly. A traitor he was, but Samuel Cayston died as a noble should, on his feet, with his honor intact and shining glory upon his house. How delusional can these blue bloods be? He actually believes the nonsense that comes out of his mouth, Wyatt thought with mild pity directed at the abrasive old man. Something that you don't know anything about, Commoner, Lukacs carried on. During the battle against the Cayston forces, Commander Redford's decision to trust your judgment brought down the damnable stealth cruiser that caused so much havoc amidst our fleet. Do you deny this? I do not. Seeing as I was the only one with any amount of experience dealing with those black ships, I thought it pertinent to inform Commander Redford about the possibility of an ambush. He agreed with the strategy and it destroyed the cruiser, he replied firmly. And by doing so, you dared give orders to your superior, your commanding officer, no less, George spat out. I object. Redford stepped up. Lieutenant Wyatt Staples followed the chain of command to the best of his abilities and dutifully informed me of the threat. Given the circumstances, I decided his plan was the best course of action available to us. George ignored the gray-haired man and pointed a finger at Wyatt. You broke the rules of engagement and wandered off on your own after insulting your commanding officer's authority. Wyatt frowned. What rules of engagement? I've been a lieutenant for no more than 2 weeks. I was a warrant officer, and all I did was follow the orders given to me. I've only seen action during patrol rotations and in simulations. I still don't know how to carry out my new duties effectively. How am I to know what rules I shouldn't break if I don't know the rules? He finished, raising his voice slightly and finally giving his judges the satisfaction of seeing him lose his composure. The battle was over, and yet the wedge you were part of did not return to their ships. You gave unsolicited tactical advice to your commanding officer, broke of communications, sidestepped the authority of your wedge commander, and then nearly initiated another incident upon your return with the now absent Salazar Reed. Do you deny your crimes? Vivian listed. I deny them, Wyatt replied sternly, and now he had to endure a second parade of witnesses that, thankfully, wasn't nearly as dull nor as lengthy as the first one. Gregor Undaj, Nultar Olkara, Leopold Dakar, and the other pilots from the wedge he'd been part of spoke in his favor, correlating Redford's report and silencing the now frustrated George Lintar. When the last of the witnesses returned to his seat, Frederick took the initiative. A sidestep from the rules is the worst crime I can detect from his actions. Otherwise, given the circumstances, they fall within reason and, let us not forget, that ultimately it was Commander Redford's decision that scored the kill upon our enemy. I believe that overwrites any minor fault given his seniority. The other commanders and Admiral Damien nodded in accordance, and for the first time since the trial began, the Admiral spoke up. Now that such minor, irrelevant issues are dealt with, I shall open the most egregious charge set against you, Lieutenant Staples, Damien said, his stern, stoic expression completely devoid of emotion. You stand accused of treason, conspiracy, and collusion with both the Draymore traitors and the Drazen raiders. A QEC device was found in your quarters. At his behest, the screens set to the left and right of the room came to life, showcasing a half-a-meter-tall rectangular metallic box with only a small modulator and a series of white and blue buttons beneath it. It did not look all that impressive nor eye-catching given what it could do. Then again, being unassuming was the point of such devices in the first place, in his opinion at least. Furthermore, the assault upon Woodshaft happened once Her Majesty Princess Clara was nearly defenseless in the station and her bodyguard, Lady Cynthia, away from her. The evidence points out that you set up the trap on both ends to ensure the demise of our beloved princess, and furthermore Is this all I can expect from you? Wyatt interrupted abruptly as he stood up, his fists shaking. The room went silent as all eyes set on him. I risked my life fighting the traitors, risked my life again fighting the Drazen. You say you found that? He pointed at a screen. In my quarters when I wasn't here. What sort of idiot would leave something like that out in the open? You dare! George began, but was interrupted by the pilot. I dare! He shouted, openly glaring at them. Loyalty is its own reward. I've been nothing but loyal, and this is what I receive in return. To be pointed at, mocked, ridiculed, and accused of crimes I did not commit? Is this all a mere commoner can expect from our noble leaders?" he said, his voice thick with venom. "If that is to be the case, then so be it. If you want me dead so bad, then kill me, but I will not admit to any of these crimes. I don't regret any of my actions except for one. This is it. If this doesn't work, I'm not sure what will," he thought as the entire room was icy silent, watching him slowly raise a finger at the balcony and pointed at Clara. "Had I known this was the reward for my loyalty, I would not have saved you that day, princess," he hissed with poison, and saw how Clara flinched back at his statement. "I regret saving your life." With that said, he sat down and the room exploded with shouts demanding his head, dishonorable discharge, lashes, and other forms of punishment for what he had said. The commanders and Admiral Damien looked at the chaos, trying to control it with their gavels, but nothing they did worked. Everyone froze and immediately shut up when the prince stood up. Seconds stretched into eons until at last he spoke. "Take him away. I shall decide his fate at a later date." That was his command, and he turned to leave. The prince's order was obeyed instantly, and 2 Marines came to escort him out, tightly gripping his forearms and pushing him forward. Wyatt remained silent as the hectic chaos he caused became a distant noise, then a whisper, and finally, it died completely, leaving only the sound of their footsteps to reach his ears. For minutes they walked uninterrupted, and Wyatt noticed 2 things. First, a few minutes after they left, he hadn't seen anyone else come across the corridors the Marines were guiding him through. And 2, the Marines were definitely not taking him to the brig. "Where are you?" A punch to the gut shut him up, making him cough violently. "Silence, dog," the Marine that punched him ordered. Wyatt obeyed, and a few minutes later they arrived at a storage bay that was, again, mysteriously devoid of personnel. To his surprise, the Marines removed a hidden panel on the floor and tossed him inside. They jumped in and closed the panel from within the tight passage, and after a few more minutes they arrived at a fairly ample room that smelled like oil. It was poorly lit, but there was a table, a few scattered boxes, some chairs, and a few weapon racks. "They don't have ammunition, so don't even think about it," a Marine warned. "Sit down and wait. No sudden movements." Wyatt obeyed and closed his eyes, his expression as stoic as he could manage. Inwardly, he was smiling. He was inside the enemy ranks. Now all he needed to do was see if the head of the viper would come out of the sand, as Clara had put it.